So this is all about supporting diverse leaders and the importance of that. My name is Meghan Park. I'm the founder of Putting Women in Their Place, which focuses on down-ballot women making videos for them. My background is in film and television, so I know the power of media. And I wanted to see more women in office, and I wanted to help them be seen by their voters, and I wanted to help voters have more information when they head into the voting booth. So I started Putting Women in Their Place with the idea that filling the pipeline with down-ballot candidates puts them in place to move up each election cycle. And we call this the trickle-up theory of government. So I'd like to introduce my panel. We have three great people here. Sayu, but I'm going to say it wrong. Bhojwani. She's with the New American Leaders Project. She's the founder and the president of that. Next to her is Quentin James, who is with the New Collective PAC. He's the founder. And then Delmarie Cobb is has founded the Publicity Works, which is a boutique media and strategy consulting firm, political strategy consulting firm. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we have some questions. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sayu Bhojwani. We're with New American Leaders. We just dropped the word project because we made the decision that this was going to be a long-term plan to change the composition of our leadership, and particularly to create a set of leaders who are more reflective of working people, white, black, and brown. And so that's really our goal. We work by establishing a presence in a state, working with the local state-based immigrant rights organization or the state table to recruit diverse leaders, particularly those of immigrant background who have a long trajectory of work in their community. We've created a training to prepare them to run as they are with their immigrant experience as an asset rather than a liability. And we work right now in Arizona, Orange County, Michigan. We're launching in Nevada and Washington State this year, and in Georgia and Colorado next year.
Good afternoon. My name is Quentin James. I'm the co-founder of the Collective PAC. We are an organization working to recruit, train, and fund progressive black candidates running across the country at every level, local, state, and federal. We launched in 2016 very much as a response to many of the police shootings we saw around the country. Many of our peers who are millennials, younger Gen Xers who are more established in their careers were wondering what could they do to address these issues. And we landed squarely on the issue of political power. When we look around the country right now, 90% of our elected officials are white. 95% of our elected prosecutors are white. And on the candidate side, over 82% of Democratic candidates and over 96% of Republican candidates, are also white. So we have a huge diversity challenge within our government and our elected officials. And so we're trying to recruit, again, train and fund black candidates running across the country at every level. We very much see ourselves as the Emily's List for black candidates now. We've grown very quickly, probably raised around $2 million in the past 2 years, and helped elect over 25 people to office. And I'll talk a little bit more about our work this year throughout the panel, but thank you all for having me here.
Good afternoon. My name is Delmarie Cobb, and I have to remember what hat I have on. I've been a political consultant for the last almost 30 years. I opened my doors April 1st, 1990. And I was the press secretary, the national traveling press secretary for Jesse Jackson's campaign in '88. I was the first African-American press secretary for the Democratic Convention in 1996. And I was Hillary Clinton's Illinois press secretary in the last election. And thank you. And it's because of the last election that, like so many other people who said, I've got to get involved and I've got to do something, I really looked at what I was doing and I realized that I'm an endangered species. I'm an African-American, independent, progressive political consultant in Chicago. And so that is I don't have a political grandmother and I don't have a political grandfather. I've been swimming upstream a long time, and most of my candidates are candidates who are anti the establishment. And so I realized that when I close my doors, I will be probably the last person standing who's doing what I'm doing. And so I decided to found Ida's Legacy, which is Ida B. Wells' Legacy Committee, which is a political action committee, specifically to develop the next generation of progressive African American women candidates. And so I want to leave 30 years or more of knowledge and make sure that there are other people who take my place. I don't want to close my doors and that's the end of that. And everybody, good luck. So that's why I did it. And also because African American women, we are the backbone of the Democratic Party. We turn out in record numbers, and yet our issues are not being addressed. And so that was the other reason that I formed Ida's Legacy. And we're only in Chicago and Illinois. But and give you an example when I say our issues are not being addressed, and I'm just going to give you one example. Oftentimes you hear white women say that women make 79 cents for every dollar a man makes. Well, black women make 64 cents for every dollar a man makes. And oftentimes, we're the head of our households. We're the only adult in the house taking care of everybody. And so, and then when you do go to college, you become the lottery ticket for your family. And so the responsibilities only grow exponentially. So I realized that we have to start taking control of the issues that other people are running on so that our issues are being addressed in the process.
Yes, very good. So we're going to start with just the general question of what does the field look like for diverse candidates this year? Quentin, why don't you start and then everybody else can answer too.
Sure. 2018 is so exciting, and I feel like it's the undercurrent to, I think, the blue wave that we're seeing is the diversity that we have in our candidates this year. So there are over 300 women running for Congress this year around the country, a record-breaking year for women congressional candidates. There are more black candidates running for Congress and running statewide than ever before in history. And if you go down the line to every kind of demographic group, we're seeing a record interest in folks stepping up to run for office. And so the opportunity is there, but no one's really talking about that. And I think the other challenge is one reason we're here is figure out how do we support these candidates, right? Unfortunately, in my opinion, both parties, but let's talk about the Democratic Party for a second, they have completely lacked a great infrastructure to support first-time candidates, especially if you're a woman or an African American, a person of color. You may be in the minority when you go to your local party meeting, right? Or you go to get involved with the state party. And so how do we also create an environment and an infrastructure that's welcoming to these folks, to give folks tools? And so I'm so excited so many groups are here to kind of think about how we're supporting this large group of folks who are now entering the system. But there is a record-breaking year in terms of the diversity of candidates who will be on the ballot, both in primaries but also in general elections. We all kind of saw last week with Stacey Abrams and her win in Georgia, hoping to become the first black woman governor in United States history. And it's because of groups like yours and others who are focusing on these demographic groups and getting them ready to run. But I think the challenge isn't just who's on the ballot and like looking at the diversity and saying yay. It is how do we make sure they have the tools, the resources, the dollars, the volunteers to win. Because having a great diverse pool of candidates who aren't prepared to win is not going to, I think, create the change that we want to see and encourage even more folks to run in 2020.
Can I answer that?
Yes, please.
So I want to say a couple of things. First, I'm going to start sort of where you left off on Stacey Abrams. So everybody was paying attention to that race, and it was a great win. But on the same day, there was a race that not very many people were paying attention to, which is for the Democratic primary, the gubernatorial primary in Texas, which Lupe Valdez won. And she's amazing. She's Dallas County Sheriff, would be the first gay Latina governor of Texas. But very much a candidate that people were not giving attention to. I mean, she already won there were two folks who won the primary earlier in the year in Texas, and then there was a runoff, right, for that. And the reason I bring that up is because I think the other thing that we can do is to not just focus on celebrity candidates. And that is a problem that we all have. And I don't know that even after Lupe's won her primary, whether there's been the same amount of attention given to her in terms of resources and building capacity, because it is possible that she will mobilize a group of voters in Texas that have never before come to the polls. And so I would like to caution about that. I also want to add that it's not just the Democratic Party that's at fault in terms of endorsements and not giving capacity. It's a lot of our kind of traditional progressive institutions. That's Emily's List, that's some of our larger unions. 40 of our alum ran in 2016, and 67% of them won. And this is in Arizona, Orange County, and Michigan, right? This is in that really negative climate. Most of them were not endorsed by the party or by major unions. Not by all unions, but by major unions. This year we have 50 candidates on the ballot, some of them running against Democratic incumbents, and the same issue keeps coming up. If you are not very well networked, if you don't have political and financial capital, it is very hard to get attention. And the thing that this is the last point I'm gonna make, I think we underestimate the value of community capital. What does it mean to be someone who has a track record in the community, has a base, and can leverage that to win a school board race or a state leg race? Maybe they're not going to win a congressional race, but they can win all these important local races.
Yeah, absolutely. So what other avenues do you see for endorsement? Who are you seeking other endorsements, or what do you see out there?
Well, I think there's Collective PAC. There's just a wave of candidates, of PACs that have arisen that can be very helpful. I think the onus, though, is on these groups to go find folks in non-traditional venues, right? I think that's really the issue is, are you reaching out to the right groups and avenues to get the names of these people who are not necessarily making it into Teen Vogue or not necessarily making it into glamour. I mean, there's a whole thing that's going on, which is fantastic.
Right.
But there's a lot for every candidate you're reading about, there's another 10. And how are you getting to those folks is really the challenge, whether it's through groups like ours or supplementing what Collective PAC is doing.
And sorry, just real quick, I want to say this, I think it's a really important point, is that for the groups who are out here doing that work to find those candidates, and we're so excited that there are some, we can call them celebrity candidates who are kind of lifted up in the media, the reality is, and I don't want you all to lose this, we don't have the capacity, both as new organizations, but also as a party, to adequately support these folks who are out there running right now, right? So we're approaching June. There are tremendous races happening across the country where there isn't the level of support needed to help folks not only win primaries, but even win in some of their general elections, right? There's a woman named Pamela Price running for a district attorney of Alameda County, right? And so as we talk about these issues around criminal justice reform, and like we're so excited that Starbucks had a training yesterday around racial bias, we can elect people who can create change in communities right now. Like not in November, but like in the next week or so. And so that's really important to know, like this isn't a, let's figure it out for November. We need to figure it out right now because these folks need help, immediately.
And that's what's so important about listening to some of what I've heard today in terms of the technology and putting it all together, because you've got people who are running now who really, they had no idea 6 months ago they would ever run. I mean, I did a campaign earlier this year for Attorney General, and there were 8 candidates in the race. And one of the women who ran, her name was Sharon Fairley, 6 months earlier, she said if someone had asked her, will you ever run for Attorney General, she would have adamantly said no. But then all of a sudden, Lisa Madigan decided to step down. This was her field of expertise, and she decided, hey, I'm going to do this. And she was in a very high-profile race, and she wound up getting 7 newspapers out of 8 statewide endorsed her, but she wasn't able to raise the money. And she fortunately had a little money. She put $400,000 of her own money in the race, or she wouldn't have even been viable. And so those are the things that also are an issue for African American candidates in particular, and women specifically, is that we do not have the networks, the natural networks, to get the kind of money that you need. And that's why it's so important that the technology is there for us to learn about candidates, and oftentimes we don't. We take the easy way out. Oh, my so-and-so's supporting them, or I know somebody who knows them, or they went to lab school, or they did this, or they did that. And those are not reasons to support anybody. I mean, you need to do your homework. And people who walk around who suddenly think that the progressive title is what I need to put on, to wear now because it's the in vogue thing. But you look at their background, and nothing in their background was progressive until they decided they were getting ready to run. And so that's the kind of homework that we've got to do, because for somebody who's been swimming upstream for a very long time, I resent anybody saying they're progressive and they're not progressive.
Yeah, absolutely. How long, let's jump ahead. How long do you think it'll take before our representatives match our citizens, the percentages?
I'm going to give an optimistic answer.
Yes, please.
So, which is not how long, but what it's going to take.
Okay.
And the first thing I will say is that I'm going to give us a few weeks, but December 1, 2018, we better take everything that's going on in here and make it into some kind of long-lasting infrastructure. Because I think what we have right now is energy. I feel very, very optimistic that we're going to break a lot of records this year, but I don't know what that means in terms of long-term infrastructure. So that's a big question. The second thing is that we're always going to be tackling this one by one or two by two until we attack the systems change issue, right? So we need more places to have single member districts so that folks can run and win on the basis of a small group of voters who they know and are connected to. We need more public financing. We need to, this is less of a system but a practice issue around the incumbent advantage and how we all line up, progressive institutions included, are not always welcoming to people of color and generally political newcomers. So that's a practice issue. But there are a series of systemic changes that are going to need to happen. And sorry, the last point that I'm going to make about the systemic changes, which is big and long-term and it's going to require a change in public opinion around how people are paid for these jobs. Because our democracy was created for wealthy, white, land-owning men. It was not created for people like us. So no matter what we do, when you have a state legislator who has to work 100 days a year and get paid $17,000, what kind of job are they going to have? What kind of living are they make? What kind of job are they going to need to have to be able to do that, right? Similarly, somebody talked about going to school board meetings for several hours a night. How are people going to balance that with childcare and all those other things? So there's like a huge, when we talk about money in politics, we often talk about the cost of campaigns. We do not talk about what I call the cost of public life. It is expensive to be here at this conference. It is expensive to work on weekends. It is expensive to work in the evenings. And white working class people, brown working class people, black working class people do not always have those resources. And so it keeps them out of political life. So we really have to think about long-term infrastructure and systems change.
Well, first I want to give a kudos to NewFounders Conference and the team who planned this for, yes, thank you. For having these conversations, right, on the main stage, not in a breakout in a small group, but kind of centering this conversation around diversity and equity in our work. So I think that's one step that has to happen, is every one of our organizations, progressive groups, our new startups, have to kind of center this work, you know, in the very beginning. I think some other good news. I mean, we recently saw the FEC ruling, now allowing campaign dollars to be spent on childcare. That work was done by many folks in this room, so give yourselves a round of applause as well. So I think some of these things are like, oh my gosh, how are we going to solve them? But some of it is happening right now in front of us. And so I feel very optimistic that I think because of what we're seeing out of the White House and the issues that are being kind of put in our face around what we don't believe America is, we have an opportunity at the ballot box this year to show what America really is. And so I think it will happen more quickly because I think we're very much being slapped in the face with the ugly that we thought did not exist anymore and that we're seeing is very much a part of our American reality.
Do you have any?
Yeah, and the other thing I was going to say, that part of what IDA's legacy wants to do, and because I focus on it from what I bring to the table, is as an African American political consultant, we also have to make sure that on these campaigns we have African American political consultants. on these campaigns, because just having black people running and the whole team is white, that does not build capacity. And the idea is to build capacity at every level. And so I see that. We saw it with the Democratic National Committee. We see that, and we see it in individual campaigns. And so that's also very important, because just having that diversity on your staff means that you're going to look at issues differently. And I can give you another example of that. Recently in Chicago on the ballot was about legalizing marijuana. Now I've got to tell you, with me traveling all over the state with my candidate, the only people who kept bringing that up were white people. Black people weren't bringing up legalizing marijuana. So when it was voted on, I had Ben Jarofsky from WCPT, which is the progressive radio station here. He happened to call me up and he says, Delmarie, you know, I've been asking everybody the same question, so I'm going to ask you this question. Why is it that there was such a big difference in how white people voted for legalizing marijuana and how black people voted for legalizing marijuana? He said it was about 20-point difference. And he said, you know, everybody's saying it's because black people are more conservative. And I said, no, that's not why black people didn't vote for it. I said, I voted for it because I take the progressive position. But I understand that as a mother of a young black man who's trying to get a job, and he goes to take a drug test, and he can't pass the drug test, so he doesn't get the job, and they're standing on the corner all day and getting in trouble. No, you are not going to vote to legalize marijuana, because in your life, it has a very different effect than it does in somebody else's life. So those are the kinds of things we have to look at.
Yeah. So are there any specific things that it takes to entice more diverse candidates to run? Are there things you talk about or target? Are there any? What will it take to get more?
Well, you know, I think people really feel the passion, and that's what you want. I mean, you want somebody to feel the fire in their belly, and that's the reason they're running, because that's the good candidate. The candidate who you've got to talk into running is not going to necessarily be the good candidate, and they may not be running for the right reasons. So I think when you see them trying to develop them and nurture them and support them, as you said, in every facet of their lives, so that they can actually do this and won't be discouraged, because it is very hard. And it's certainly hard for a first-time candidate, and it's hard if you're going up against an incumbent. And a lot of times, we want them to go up against an incumbent because the incumbent is the one who hasn't been doing their job. And so that we've got to be there for them when they do that, and not necessarily go with the party candidate, but go with the candidate who we think can not just necessarily win, but if they win, they will make a difference.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, from my work, I think the biggest challenge I hear from folks who want to run and decide not to, or run and may not be prepared, is the challenge of money. So we've already heard some structural challenges around public financing and other opportunities. I think the other reality, though, is that many of our organizations, whether they be labor unions, progressive groups, party committees, like, we have to put pressure on them to invest in candidates of color. Yes, we need to raise more money and build new donors, but there's a lot of money right now in the progressive, ecostructure that isn't really being prioritized for candidates of color, for women. And so I am focused, and I think our organization is, on not just recruiting folks and being able to raise new money for them, but to hold folks accountable to the, $800 million we're going to spend this year on this midterm election, if not more. Like, where is that money going? How is it being prioritized? We've all heard the conversation around, television ads versus other spending on campaigns. We need to be able to, earmark some of that money for diverse candidates in a way that I think will make some of us uncomfortable and have some kind of uncomfortable conversations. But it's the only way that we're going to have, equal the playing field for folks who, again, were not born in political families and legacies, or have a huge network. That's beyond race, right? Beyond gender. That's like really to the core of, how do we want our government to look, right? Who do we want to serve? That's a real important question that we have to solve before we get to 2020.
I think for our folks, the biggest issue is, in addition to money and lack of networks, is this constant perception that they're outsiders. That gets reinforced, across the board, not just by the president, but by media and the others. So there's 5 things that people bring up consistently, which is, I'm worried about my skin color, I'm worried about my religion, I'm worried about my immigration status, I'm worried about my name and my appearance, right? So all of those are markers of identity. And while I think everyone who runs for office is concerned about how their story is going to play out in the public arena, for immigrants and refugees in particular, there is this added concern about this constant othering that happens, right? And I think for people of color in general, and the fear that they have about putting their family members who may also be undocumented or may have a criminal record or something, a lot of it is about fear of perception. And so one of the ways that we address that is really to talk about how what they bring to the political process is an important asset, right? And how what they have is what is needed in our legislatures. That experience, and frankly, I think that immigrants are the most optimistic about American democracy because we are constantly fighting to get here and fighting to stay here, and we bring this incredible optimism. So I think the most important thing that we can do for candidates of color is to encourage them to stay who they are and be authentic and run in that way rather than trying to get them to follow some outdated playbook, which frankly didn't work for many of our candidates in 2016. By our, I mean progressive/democratic candidates, which are not necessarily the same thing. I appreciate that. But I think getting people to run exactly the way they are, running an authentic campaign, expanding the electorate, because that is something that candidates of color, and particularly immigrant and refugees, can do, because often they themselves, I'll just say this last point, there were 3 women in Arizona who ran and won their elections in 2016. All 3 of them had been formerly undocumented, and 2 of them were voting they were voting for themselves in the first election that they were ever voting in. And this is in 2016 in Arizona. So the possibilities are really endless. We just have to make sure that we're not relying on outmoded ways of campaigning.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have anything else you'd like to add? I've been asked to shave a few minutes off of our panel.
Well, I always say, I always have poor campaigns with rich messages. So that's been from the first campaign I ever did, which was Jesse Jackson. So, you have to find different ways to campaign. And what I found is, and I found this when I did Hillary Clinton's campaign, and I thought it was just me. Of course, I became the old woman on the campaign who didn't know anything about about the internet or social media. And yet I do this every day because I couldn't do my living if I wasn't keeping up with the times. Not that I want to, but I have to. So I just thought it was interesting, but I thought, okay, they just don't know, because I'm jumping up and down like a crazy person, telling them you need to do this, and you need to do that, and you need to do the other. But then when I worked on this last campaign, it hit me, it's not that they resist, it's that they don't know. And so it's an either or. It's social media or it's grassroots. But there is no either or, it's and both. You have to incorporate and both, especially if you don't have money. If you don't have money, you have to out-campaign your opponent. And you have to say, I am not going to sleep. And I can sleep after Election Day. And so those are the things you have to think about and make up for as an African-American candidate or a woman candidate, but specifically as a black woman candidate, because you're going to have fewer resources than your opponent, whether your opponent is a man or your opponent is white. You're going to have fewer resources, so you have to make it up.
I'll just close with 2 things. Thank you. Yes. I'll close with 2 quick things. One is just do the work, right? So don't take the easy route out. That is, if you're an organization or your local party meeting or your state party, whatever role you play, make sure that this conversation is being held at that table. Second is your money. Our organization needs your money, but also others do as well. So pick a group, one of the new groups who are here, groups like Run for Something, Latino Victory, Collective PAC, whatever group it is. become a monthly contributing donor, whether it's $1 a month, $5 a month, whatever you can afford. Make that step to help sustain this work because these groups are on the front lines doing this work every single day. But other than that, thank you all for having me. This has been great.
Well, thank you for that inspiration. New American leaders, also, please do become a monthly donor. I'm going to actually be very tactical. One is I'll just mention the states again that we're working in case there's some synergies. Arizona, Orange County, California, Michigan, Washington, Nevada, and then Colorado and Georgia next year. So I'm happy to talk to folks about any potential synergies this year and going forward. And the other is that also super tactical because we found repeatedly that people were having these systemic issues. I've written a book that comes out on October 2nd called People Like Us about how we can transform our democracy so that it works for working people of all backgrounds. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.